Hello and welcome to This Week in the Triangle. My name is Stephen Horn. I'm an independent journalist, and this is where I talk about some of the stories over the last week here in North Carolina. These stories aren't necessarily the most important stories in the area, but they're stories where I feel I can add some some useful context, some facts, some put together some pieces for you that other outlets might not. I started doing this because I, like many of the residents of the Triangle, residents of North Carolina, even residents of the entire United States, are not happy with mainstream media. We don't think it does a good job picking which stories to cover and picking how they cover the stories that they do cover. So I started this week in the Triangle and the Triangle Trumpet, just to, have an outlet to publish the news, which I think the mainstream media could do better on. So you can head over to triangletrumpet.news. That's where I'm over on Substack. I publish articles, and I also publish a weekly roundup with some shorter items from some stories on the week, and that's what I'm going to go over in this broadcast and talk about some of them. So our first story up here is from Cary, of course, in Wake County, one of the largest municipalities in the state, though. It's colloquially only known as the containment area for relocated Yankees, because just a few short decades ago, Cary was tiny. It was a few thousand people. Now it is a few 100,000, because the growth has been entirely the result of mass migration. And that's why people around there are known for being Yankees. But our story today has nothing to do with it. So, an attendee, a frequenter of a certain Wendy's location in Cary on Harrison Avenue, he looks over, he sees there is a noose hanging from the ceiling. You see, Wendy's has a partnership, a collaboration with Netflix, and specifically their show Wednesday, which is a very death and darkness themed show. And so as part of the decorations, part of the spooky decorations, they put up a noose. Now, some people, when they see noose, they think, oh, this is a symbol of racism. This is symbolism rooted in a racist past. That's literally a quote from the WREL coverage. And I just want to say, if you look at a noose and you see symbolism of a racist past, that is cultural appropriation. Okay, the first recorded instance we have of, hanging being used as a method of execution is recorded in Homer's Odyssey. Now, obviously, did it actually happen? Who knows? Who knows? I believe it's a work of fiction. But they were aware of the concept of hanging. So when Ulysses was hanging the unfaithful maids, was he thinking about Black people? No, absolutely not. When the Germans were hanging people all throughout the Middle Ages, were they thinking, oh, what will the people in Africa think about this? No, of course not. They weren't even necessarily aware that Africa or Black people even existed. And so when the English came to America, they brought hanging with them as a method of execution. But so to try to limit hanging in the noose, the symbolism of that, to just 100-year period where something like 4,000 Black people were lynched, as part of these racist extrajudicial killings, sometimes torturings, very awful stuff. But to limit the thousands of years of hanging to make, oh, the only symbolism is 100 years, that's absurd. To compare those, to make it all about those 4,000 people, not the countless. Literally, we have no idea the total number of people who have been hanged throughout thousands of years of European history. We don't know, but it's not small. It's not anywhere close to 4,000. They're hanging people in North Carolina as judicial punishment, as capital punishment, up until 1910. That was the last hanging in North Carolina, or court-ordered hanging. Because after that, the state took over and they decided, instead of hanging people, we will do, electrocution, the electric chair, suffocation, lethal injection, I believe, is the only currently approved method of execution in North Carolina. But they did keep hanging people. The U.S. military, I believe the last hanging by the U.S. military was in 1961 for someone who done something very awful while stationed overseas. And they hung Nazis at the Nuremberg trials. But to take that long history of hanging and make it all about these lynchings over 100 years, which was a couple hundred people a year at most. The people who Jeffrey Epstein themselves, taking their own lives via hanging every year, is far higher, at least an order of magnitude higher than the worst year for lynching. So to try to take all of that and say, oh no, this symbolism is all about racism, that is cultural appropriation, and that is the sort of hot take that I bring to you. So obviously, the Carries was like, or sorry, the Wendy's and Carrie was like, oh yeah, we're sorry about the whole news thing. We're sorry that we offended these civil rights activists, which I will say, it is very frustrating because this idea that like anything related to a noose or black people dying from hanging has to be a lynching is this powerful concept. That some people phrase it as the demand for racism exceeds the supply, and a case of this was happened just this year in Henderson County, where a 20-year-old black truck driver was found dead with a rope wrapped around his neck, and this story made national news. People still talk about it, still post about it, like, oh, this black man was found hanging in a sundown town. Okay, if you think Henderson, North Carolina is a sundown town, I have to break it to you. You are absurd. You are ignorant. You have no idea what you're talking about. You can look it up. Henderson, North Carolina. There is a lot of black people in Henderson, North Carolina. There's a lot of black people in Vance County. The sheriff of Vance County, who's trying to tell people, no, this was not a lynching, that is a black man. The definition of a sundown town is that black people cannot be there after sundown. You really think a town that's half or over half black people is a sundown town? Obviously not. But this absurd idea of putting the fact second and putting the narrative first. Oh, this was a lynching. No, it wasn't. Unfortunately, there are many people who take their own lives using some sort of hanging. That is how Jeffrey Epstein is alleged to have died, and it's in the thousands every year from the sources I saw. This the second most common method used when people take their own lives, and somewhat ironically, black people who commit suicide are more likely to do so via hanging than via firearm, which is they're more likely than white people to kill themselves by hanging versus other methods such as firearms, which is the most common method used to take one's own life in America. Obviously, very tragic topic, very tragic stories, but these civil rights activists, that's how they're framed. They take these tragic stories or these silly stories and make them into this narrative of, oh, this is all about black people lynching, whatever, trying to keep it alive. Governor Josh Stein just signed an executive order in June proclaiming it. What is it? Proclaiming it Anti-Lynching Awareness Month. So I'm sure there's a lot of people who go to school. The only thing they hear about hanging is lynching, these extrajudicial executions, and they're not told about the long and rich history of lynching as capital punishment in Europe, used by Europeans. This is a part of European culture, but it has been appropriated by these civil rights activists to be all about this narrow set of extrajudicial assassinations, extrajudicial murders, extrajudicial vigilantism against black people. Trying to make hanging all about that is cultural appropriation, and that is what I will stand on. And our next story here is kind of strange. There is quite a few arrests this week and in the past month from the NC State Bureau of Investigation and the North Carolina Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. These arrests were announced over the past week. So I don't, sometimes it's just random. Sometimes it's the result of, I guess, various investigations. But, there are several arrests that kind of struck me that there are multiple in the same time period. So let's go over several of them. So the first one is down in Harnett County. A soldier actually from Fort Bragg named Chad Michael Johnson, 36 years old, arrested on some very heinous charges regarding material that he had on his phone. And this was actually found because his wife called the sheriff's office and said he put a camera in the bathroom to record his sister-in-law. So the police came, or the sheriff came, got a search warrant, searched his phone, found even worse stuff. So that is he's a combat medical specialist stationed at Fort Bragg, and he is being held on a $200,000 bond. Some of these other arrests here, we have a man in Johnson County. They originally started investigating this man, Austin Barrett Cruz, because they got a tip from a child predator sting by the Owatonna Police Department in Minnesota, who said Cruz attempted to meet with an 8-year-old girl. And while they were investigating him, they also received tips from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation about the same man. And when they went to arrest him and search his house, they found some meth related items, which he had a previous legal history involving a meth arrest as well. And he was found living in an address with an adult female and 2 small children. And he's being held on a total bond of $370,000 with both those sexual exploitation charges as well as the meth. And we had a guilty plea from a former Johnson County Sheriff's Deputy, Michael Medlin, and his wife, Amy Medlin, a former Johnson County teacher, in relation to a former student of hers at Corinth Holders High. So the former sheriff's deputy pleaded guilty to simple assault, providing alcohol to a minor and accessing a government computer, while the former teacher pleaded guilty to indecent liberties with a student. So very messed up situation there. And in Orange County, there was another man, Juan David Roa Unas, also arrested after tips from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. But what's crazy about this case is that this man, unlike some of the others who had bonds set at hundreds of thousands of dollars, he was released on only a $5,000 bond, even though he was charged with 10 counts of second-degree sexual exploitation of a minor. So it seems like maybe there's different factors that aren't in any of the court documents that are released to the public. The e-court system has some documents, but not necessarily everything. So maybe there was some factor that they really believe they could release him. But it seems like there is this vast disparity between different courts in, how seriously they take stuff like this. And also had an arrest up in Person County. Kyle Shanyo in Rougemont, also charged with 10 counts. And I believe 10 counts is just the maximum number of counts they can put on their arrest warrant form. It doesn't necessarily mean that they only found 10 pieces of material. In this case, the Person County Sheriff's Office, which is part of the ICAC task force, they searched. They said they seized hundreds of videos and additional digital evidence, and he's being held on a $150,000 bond. And another story this week, somewhat related. So a priest down in Johnson County has been charged with soliciting a male prostitute. So the deputies were in the area of St. Anne Catholic Church. They were looking for an unrelated juvenile, and they see this priest, Clemente Guerrero Olvera, 47 years old, running around the back of the church. So they're like, hey, what's going on? So they arrest him. They find, a 20-year-old black male in the parking lot, and they do some investigation, and they find out that, he had arranged to meet this homosexual prostitute on Grindr. This was around 1:00 in the morning. Not a time that if there's any time for a Catholic priest to be sitting in a car with a homosexual prostitute, it's not 1 in the morning. And so he was arrested, charged with solicitation, and the young man he was with was charged with prostitution. And so the Diocese of Raleigh issued a statement saying that he was immediately removed from ministry in the Diocese of Raleigh. So Olvera was a parochial vicar at the church. I believe that is the correct way to say it, parochial vicar. And the next story we have here is a bit of a follow-up. As I have reported on, I guess probably for years at this point, there is a medical watchdog organization called US Right to Know, and they have been suing UNC trying to get records, public records related to their investigation into the origins of COVID-19. And anyone who is familiar with the origins at all probably knows a little bit about UNC and the connection there with Dr. Ralph Barrett, the famous coronavirologist, and their potential ties with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Let me get the name correct. I believe that is the correct name. Basically, the Wuhan Virology, where the bat coronavirus that they were studying mysteriously shows up. Barrett had ties to that university. There's also the diffuse proposal that he was involved with UNC. So they had filed a number of public records requests for different sets of records, and the university ended up saying, hey, there's some records that are responsive, but we don't have to give them to you because they're a research exemption to the state's public records law. And so it ended up in a lawsuit, and the Orange County Court ended up ruling that a number of the records would not have to be disclosed. And so, what ends up happening is that US Right to Know has filed an appeal. And this week, Attorney General Jeff Jackson filed a response, basically saying, no, we shouldn't have to, you should, the trial court was correct. These records are not public records. They fall under this research exemption. And so, reiterated the arguments regarding the construction of the statute. But one thing that he brought up in this brief that I thought was interesting was a Virginia Supreme Court ruling. Now, obviously, the Virginia Supreme Court is not binding on North Carolina courts, especially because they are working with a different set of laws. But apparently, the research exemption in Virginia's law is somewhat similar. And so the Supreme Court in Virginia found that releasing documents, I believe it was a lawsuit over research records for some study related to climate change. And the court found that it could cause harm to university-wide research efforts, damage to faculty recruitment and retention, undermining of faculty expectations of privacy and confidentiality, and impairment of free thought and expression if the public got a hold of certain records, including the communication between public university researchers and private university researchers. So, this is kind of interesting to me. I think that the public trust in public institutions might be more harmed if there's records that are not available to the public. That is when you email a lot of government officials, and if they respond to you, you'll see a little disclaimer at the bottom. These emails are subject to public records requests. And so as a member of the public communicating with public officials, that's just something you have to live with. That someone could file public records requests, and the email that you've sent to some public official might be part of that record. But apparently for research, when even when it's something so obviously of public significance, a virus that caused so much, not just the death, not just the sickness, but so many political repercussions on the economy, on our freedoms, whatnot. If you're investigating the origins of this, obviously that is in the public interest, but the argument is being made by the government that no, they don't have to turn this over. But this all might be a moot point because the North Carolina state legislature, at least one committee has expressed interest in looking at those documents themselves. So the public records law relates to what records the public can obtain. But the North Carolina state legislature has oversight over the University of North Carolina system, and they can get whatever records they want, regardless of what the public records law is, because they're not the public, they're the bosses. They have the oversight. And our final story here is about a former town commissioner in Wake Forest who has been arrested and charged with embezzling nearly $70,000. And that story is newsworthy enough on its own. But what is crazy is that this investigation into her appears to have been put into motion by an article that she got removed from the internet. So there's an article back in July 2024 by Carol Pelosi of the Wake Forest Gazette, basically revealing these allegations that Liz Simpers, a former Wake Forest town commissioner and the president of the Wake Forest Area Chamber of Commerce, that she had embezzled a large sum of money. And so when the Simpers didn't take kindly to these allegations being put out there, she had her lawyers contact Pelosi and Pelosi is an independent publisher. She ends up agreeing to take the article down in order to end the legal threats. And at the time, the mayor of Wake Forest, Vivian Jones, issued a statement in response to questions saying, "Hey, are the police investigating this?" And at the time, she said, "No, the police are not investigating this because the chamber had not reported being a victim of a crime." But last week, the Wake Forest police says after a 13-month investigation, we are now putting these charges forward. They say she misappropriated money for hardscape and masonry work at her personal residence, tree services, plumbing services, party bus rental, orthopedic services, professional photographs, residential plumbing repairs, and various Amazon retail items. A whole list of things adding up to nearly $70,000. But if you do the math, a 13-month investigation, that puts it back in July 2024, right when this article was released and then removed. And if the mayor was accurate in the fact that they had not begun the investigation shortly after the article, it kind of definitely seems like whether the article itself or the public outcry, or maybe the chamber saying, "Hey, people care about this, we really should report to the police." But it definitely seems that these charges were put in motion by that article. So yeah, didn't work out for her too well. She might have got the article taken down, but Carol Pelosi got the last laugh. And there were a number of mainstream outlets reporting on this, obviously, but I believe I may have been the only one who got a comment from Carol Pelosi about the arrest, and this is what she had to say. Quote, "Liz Simpers is a congenital embezzler and has proved it several times. She has a trail of non-disclosure agreements from the time she graduated from North Carolina's School of Design, and most likely before. She can be pitied for her obsession, but no one should ever hire her, place her in a position where she has any access to funds, or believe her. I hope she and her wife and family move from Wake Forest." That's a pretty scathing comment from that independent publisher who, took an article down under pressure from attorneys. And that is all of our stories for tonight. If you've been tuning in, thank you for being here. You can find this in newsletter form at triangletrumpet.news. Have a good night or morning, afternoon, whenever you may be seeing this.